Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our program, Seizing the Moment to Defeat DEI. Please welcome Mike Gonzalez, Senior Fellow in the International Engagement at the Heritage Foundation.
Thank you very much, and welcome to Heritage, to you and to the many people we have online. We live in a paradoxical age. DEI and CRT are simply everywhere. They're in our schools and universities, of course, but they're also in our houses of worship, our military barracks, our sports fields, medical hospitals, museums, the media. It is simply exhausting. At the same time, DEI is on the run. Everywhere you look, there are stories about how companies are ditching their DEI teams, how cities, even this leftist dystopia that we call Washington, D.C., are abandoning laws that protect the criminal and leave the population defenseless. Some universities have lost their presidents. Some universities are reversing decisions not to require standardized testing. And we just had a really good anti-DEI movie made in Hollywood, American Fiction, that was up for an Academy Award. So every day, the Washington Post and New York Times are running panic stories about how all the cultural changes that were implemented during or just after the 2020 BLM riots are being dismantled. For that is what happened. The leaders of our cultural institutions were intimidated by the 2020 riots and implemented a raft of cultural changes that the American people are now rejecting. The American people are waking up to this threat that DEI poses to our freedoms, to our way of life, to our peace of mind, to our natural desire to have common national purposes, and to our national security. The horrible reaction by some young people to the atrocities committed by Hamas in Israel on October 7th have woken up a lot of people to the fact that, well, perhaps it's not a good idea to teach the young to look at all of life through the prism of oppressed versus the oppressor. I call this the October 8th effect. It has opened the window of opportunity. But the American people need help from our politicians, the media activists, et cetera, to keep that window open. Today we have this event, bringing together many people from all walks of life, many experts, to take the temperature of the moment, give us some idea about what lies ahead. We have Christina Rasmussen, who will be in the first panel, here to discuss the latest in the medical field. Will Fibbo, who's going to speak the same about national defense. Aaron Sibarium of the Washington Free Beacon, whose muckraking journalism is a rebuke to the mainstream media, and many, many more. None of them, and certainly not me, would reject diversity, equity, and inclusion if those words meant what they used to mean. But today, they mean the opposite. So thank you for coming, what they have to say. But first, let me call to the stage our Vice President of Government Relations, Eric Teitzel, and the great Burgess Owens, today a member of the House of Representatives from Utah, but to people of my generation, the hero defensive back for the 1980 Super Bowl winning Oakland Raiders. Gentlemen.
Thank you, Mike.
Thanks, Mike. When Mike says from his generation, I mean, it's back when the Raiders used to win football games all the time. There was a time, right, Mike? Okay.
I was just going to say, I think that you and I sitting here today is a wonderful example of diversity and inclusion because you are an Oakland Raider and I am a Kansas City Chiefs fan.
There we go.
And
It says it all, doesn't
here
it?
we are. It's just showing bridges can be built. Thank you for being here this morning. Thanks to everyone of you being here this morning and to those of you joining us online. I don't know if you know this, but the congressional hearing of which you helped to lead that was hosted in the wake of the October 7th atrocities is now allegedly the most watched congressional hearing of all time. And I think arguably the one that had the most immediate, tangible effect. So I just want to open by asking you to tell us the story of that hearing.
First of all, I'll say this, and Mike nailed it. this has been something we've been dealing with for quite a while. I call it cancer. And we were just talking about this on the way over here that the left loves to push back on that, but it's indeed a cancer. It's something that's been happening for decades, really, and it's just now we're beginning to see as a people what it looks like. We've seen this, excuse me, we've seen this and been very frustrated to a degree over the years, but October 7th really brought it to light because we are a culture of empathy. You know, that's who we are. You go back in our history, we're the country that goes out and helps others win back their freedom, then come back home and build our own society. And we wake up one day and find out our kids have been caught up in this empathy-free mentality of anger and divisiveness, and we're trying to figure where in the world it's coming from. Well, now we know. It's been happening on our college campuses. This is the genesis of the most divisive ideology that our country's ever dealt with, and it's from within. We're seeing that from within our own country, a place that we believe in freedom, a place we building our dreams and our hopes and preparing our kids to go to a place where they're going to prepare themselves to be productive individuals. Well, we go and do our part. We send them to these colleges, and they come back not only in debt with degrees that mean nothing, but hating our country at the same time. And we never knew how this happened. I think October 7th was just kind of highlighted in the most evil terms of what we're after, what's been after us. So I'm excited about a couple things. I'm excited that we the people allowed the Republican Party to have the majority. It's a very small majority. It gets frustrating because it's so small. But because we least the majority, we had this hearing on DEI. We had this hearing on anti-Semitism. We're having more hearings on things that really matter to our culture that would not have happened, my friends, if it was not for the fact that we the people got the Republican Party in charge, and we're looking at what really will take to hold on to our culture. So I want to say this. Yes, we look at the political place as being where answers are solved, but it begins with we the people, because it's your voices that's given us opportunity, and it's your voices that will give us a chance to get a bigger majority, a Senate, and a president who cares about our country that will get us coming back the way we should be. There was something that excuse me. There's something that Thomas Jefferson said that's so apropos. Ignorant and free can never be. This country has always been built on education, on wisdom, on insight, on appreciation for where we come from and where we're going, and a vision of what we can become. There's no country ever in history of mankind that's been developed and structured the way ours has been. We are the one country that our founders realized they were not perfect. So they said we will become a more perfect union. Right now we have people in charge of our country that believe that they are perfect, and therefore they're judging everybody else as imperfect. And that doesn't work. That's not who we are. So to become a more perfect union, we have to be able to reflect back on who we are, what we're doing, the mistakes we've made. And every one of us in this room here, we look back on our lives, and we say, you know what, if I had a chance to do that over again, 10 years ago, 30 years ago, I would have totally done it different. But because of that experience, we now have built to where we know we'll never do what we did, those mistakes ever again. That's because we look at how we can be a more perfect person, to be a happier person. That is what our country is. And I'll say this, we're just beginning. The American people waking up. This is a long answer to a short question. One last little idea I want you guys to think about. These are very chaotic times right now. But think about how it's always been with Americans. We live in this little freedom bubble. And that's the promise of America. Freedom bubble is we build our dreams, we raise our families, we take our vacations, look at retirement, we spend time with our friends just to build great memories, we go to Disney World, all those kind of things. And that's where we love to be, but sometimes we get there's evil on the outside of that little freedom bubble. And what happens when Americans realize there's evil out there, we come out of that bubble and go to work. Whether it be World War II, Pearl Harbor, whether it be 9/11, we come out and say, okay, we got to get busy. We're going to come off out the sideline and get to work. And the minute we win, we go back to our freedom bubble where we want to be anyway. So our goal right now is to take care of these issues we're going through right now. We have an administration that we're against, that's really against the war. We're in a war against our own federal government at this point. And that's what we're seeing. But once we win this, We get back to where we have the great majority. We have a president who cares about it. We're going to go back to living the bubble, this freedom bubble that we all want to be in, and that we can't wait to get there so we can have fun again and enjoy this process.
Well, thank you for that. Great answer. You recently hosted another committee hearing I wanted to ask you about. It was called Divisive, Excessive, Ineffective. I see what you did there. That's good staff work. The real impact of DEI on college campuses specifically. There used to be this notion that college students went to school and yeah, they kind of went left, but then they'd graduate, they'd get a job, they'd get married, they'd have kids, they'd start paying taxes, and that leftist ideology would sort of fade away as they face the realities of the work life and the real world. But now you call DEI a cancer, and that cancer has metastasized. It's in every aspect of our lives. It's in corporate America, it's in the military, it's in our churches. Why did that happen? And what do we do now, knowing that, and knowing that what starts on campus doesn't necessarily end when they graduate?
We first have to understand that the idea of America is very unique. It's based on a spiritual concept that there's a God in heaven, that no matter how we worship him, it means that we need to be the best people we can be to be happy. That's the foundation. Understanding that, there's also the other side, which hates everything that we stand for. What do we stand for? Faith, family, the free market, and education. Every community that ties into that, including my community back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, we believed in that, even though I grew up in a segregated community. Because we believe in those four tenets, guess what? The black community led our country in the growth of the middle class, the 40s, 50s, and 60s. My first experience to white Americans didn't happen until I was 16 years old. But yet around me, I saw something very similar to what other communities were seeing, even though we were not assimilating. We led the country in growth of the middle class. Men matriculated from college, men committed to marriage, and from percentage of entrepreneurs. In every community, the French, the Italian, the Jewish, they're all doing the same thing, being proud to be Americans first. So based on that, I have to understand the war we're really having is one against a Marxist ideology that hates everything we stand for. They hate family, the free market, education, and what's the other one? Faith. They hate it all. So this has been a long-term fight we've been after. John Dewey was one of the first. I mean, they understand one thing. They can either tell us who they are and be courageous, which they're not, or they can hide like little termites and go for the long game. And the long game is going to be over time. They have the patience to know that over the decades, things can change where they will finally, maybe not in their lifetime, but they will change the country the way this other ideology goes. So John Dewey was one of the first. And they realized if you get into the college, you teach the teachers to teach the teachers. And that's what's happening. You have our kids going there, wide-eyed, bushy-tailed, ready to build a great society, and they come out little Marxists, and they take that and they go back into the K through 12 and teach little kids to be Marxists. So there's no longer in higher ed. It's now all the way, and that's you think about who these people are. There is no one too young for them to attack. There's no one too innocent for them to attack. This is pure evil. So when I talk about cancer, it is exactly what it is. The upside, and I tell you, I'll say this: I had prostate cancer. The reason I'm sitting here before you today because I found it early. What's happening in our country right now, we're finding it early enough. And I think that's a blessing. We're going to look back on 2024, I believe, and going to say this was a miracle year because American people woke up. They got engaged. They started asking questions, demanding answers, and demanding truth. And that says a lot about who we are, and I think the timing is so perfect to make that happen. So this is a long-term fight. The fact is now we know it's a fight we need to fight, and we're going to address it, and looking forward to that.
Thank you, sir. Our time is short. You have to go ban TikTok here in 1 minute, and I don't want you to miss that vote. So thank you for being here with us this morning. We're with you in this fight together. Really appreciate it.
Let me just say this. First of all, this is going so fast. Gosh, maybe I talk too much. I don't know, but I want to thank you guys. I say this as often as I can because I realize that for us to win, we need to have people like you. Everybody has their own talent. And leave with a real quick Raider story, if you guys don't mind, okay?
I do mind.
The thing about the Raiders, when I was played, it was a remarkable culture because Al Davis, unlike anyone that I've ever seen, I'm so thankful to have been played under his reign. He believed in the American dream of second chances. So if you look at the Raiders of old, if you're too old, too rambunctious, too wild, too crazy to be on any other team, you're just right for the Raiders. Because by the time you got the Raiders, you're just so happy to play with any team. You just want to be there. And you knew this was the last chance, by the way. You don't make it here, there's no place else to go. But here's the thing. His idea was it didn't matter what your past was. You show up, you get on the field, and you help us win, you are a Raider. Just win, baby, was his whole thing. Doesn't matter all this other stuff, just win, baby. And the year I got there was like 13 guys were brought in, and it was a transitional process. It was supposed to be a rebuilding year. But the guys that came on, like myself, who was at the Jets for 7 years, and by the way, for Jet fans, they did 40 years ago what they're doing today. Just can't figure out how to win. But they get their fans excited for a hot minute. Anyway. But the one thing that I knew when I got there is I was so sick and tired of losing that I'll do anything. I don't care who got the credit. And just imagine the entire team feeling the same way. We had a guy named Ray Guy, who was a punter. Ray would come in on our 10-yard line and kick to their 10-yard line. And we had those kind of players that doing their little part, maybe three times a game, but whenever we stepped on the field, everybody gave everything. We ended up going into that season, finally winning, and first time since high school, winning and playoffs and a whole bit. And I look back on that year, and I think about it this way. It was a year, the first time I've seen in my lifetime, where no matter what position you played, how long you're on the field, when you stepped on the field, you gave everything. My goal very simply was just not to be the weak link. Imagine the entire team feeling that same way, that they were not going to be the weak link. At the end of the day, we got the Super Bowl championship. We have a chance right now with every one of us. We have talents. Every one of the guys have been prepared for this moment. Whatever that talent might be, doing what you're doing right now, might be somebody just have a smile on their face and that person just wants to have somebody to talk with. You're the person that they do that with. We need to bring that talent to the field now because our country needs us now. We get back 2024, get a bigger majority in the House, get the Senate, get a President Trump who really loves our country. 20 months, my friends, 20 months, and we'll be exposed to so much more and turn this whole thing around. It'll be exciting for us to see it, and we can say that we were there when our country turned ourselves around and came off the abyss. So I look forward to that. Know that the black community is waking up, the Jewish community is waking up, the Hispanic community is waking up. As Americans, we're seeing we need to fight to get our country back. So I look forward to being part of that process. Okay?
Thank you, sir, very much. That was wonderful. With that, let me introduce my wonderful colleague, Lindsay Burke.
Great. Well, thank you, Eric, and thank you, Congressman Owens. That was inspiring. Just as we know the sun sets in the West, we know higher education has a DEI problem. Representative Owens called it a cancer, as did Eric Tietzel, which is correct. DEI has metastasized and spread throughout the academy. But this panel is about how DEI has infected particular higher education domains, colleges of education, medical schools, law schools. Conservatives once thought, as Eric said a minute ago, that DEI, CRT, the alphabet soup of woke ideology could be confined to colleges. That, as with so many other things, students would graduate, enter the workforce, be mugged by reality, and abandon their woke ways. Unfortunately, rather than being mugged by reality, they have captured American institutions, from the military and media to philanthropy and corporations. The joke used to be, as Henry Kissinger is reported to have said, that the reason university politics are so vicious is because the stakes are so low. But unfortunately, The stakes could not be higher today when it comes to DEI. So here to discuss all of this is our fantastic panel of experts. We will be joined by one additional expert, Nikki Neely, in just a few minutes. Sarah Perry is a senior legal fellow for the Edwin Meese III Center for Legal and Judicial Studies at the Heritage Foundation, where she focuses on civil rights, constitutional governance, regulatory policy, and the proper role of the courts. Prior to joining Heritage, she was senior counsel to the Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Education. To her left is Christina Rasmussen, who is Executive Director of Do No Harm, which represents physicians, nurses, and medical students, patients, and policymakers, all focused on keeping identity politics out of medical education, research, and clinical practice. She previously served as the president of a major think tank and a chief of staff to a governor. Jay Green is Senior Research Fellow in the Center for Education Policy here at Heritage. Prior to joining Heritage, Dr. Green was at the University of Arkansas, where he served as Distinguished Professor and Chair of the Department of Education Reform, which he founded and led for 16 years. And Nikki Neely will be joining us in a moment. Nicole Neely is President and founder of Parents Defending Education. She is also the founder of Speech First, a national campus free speech organization, and prior to that, worked at the Independent Women's Forum and the Cato Institute. Please join me in welcoming our panelists. So we actually didn't talk about order, but since I went with Sarah first, Sarah, maybe we'll allow you to kick us off with a discussion on law schools.
So the problem with American law schools and DEI is really twofold. First of all, critical race theory started in American law schools. As we all know, Derek Bell, who was the godfather of critical race theory, was a law professor at Harvard, and believing that the American justice system could not ever be impartial, instituted a program of study and principles that essentially were designed to dismantle racism in our cultural institutions and in our legal system itself. So CRT itself is continually taught as a principle, as a guiding light in American legal classrooms. That's where it started. We are, as lawyers, unfortunately, the bad ones anyway, the original progenitors of anti-racism racism in American classrooms. The other problem in American law schools is the ABA's accrediting authority. Now, let's talk a little bit about the American Bar Association. The ABA was actually designed to institutionalize racism. It was formed in 1878 and did not admit African Americans for 66 years. Now, that's slightly ironic considering now, among its other requirements for American law school students, they are required to take a class on bias, cross-cultural competency, and racism, not just once, but twice in their legal education, at the beginning and again at the end. That's in addition to a class on ethics in which they are told to dismantle racism overtly. So this is very ironic considering that a membership organization of approximately 400,000 members, a volunteer membership organization, represents only 30% of the practicing lawyers in the country. And yet, to sit for the bar in every one of the states in America, you have to graduate from an ABA-approved law school. So it's an outsized influence not only on what we see in American classrooms, but also what we see taking place in the judiciary. We have essentially tainted the notion of an impartial judiciary. And in fact, post-George Floyd riots, we saw state-level judges calling for work to dismantle racism. This is supposed to be the only non-political branch in the American governance system. So as you can see, we have a lot of work to do in American law schools, but I think for many of us on this panel, we're up to the task.
So Christina, are things that bad in medical schools?
Thanks a lot. We really appreciate it, you lawyers coming and messing up medicine. So the answer is yes. Many of us would like to think that some of these ideologies are contained to the social sciences. Like you're going to find them in the education schools, maybe in the law schools, but surely the hard sciences of medicine and engineering and architecture, these are all protected because it's supposed to be based on merit and hard math. But the scary thing is that while DEI is dangerous everywhere, it is perhaps most dangerous in medical school because it affects who becomes doctors, what are they taught, And how are they trained to view patients? And I know that when I walk into the doctor's office, I really want to know two things: that my doctor knows what they're doing, that they're the best and they're going to heal or cure my family if we are injured or sick. And that when they see me, they see the Rasmussen family, people worthy of great care because of who we are, not because we're assigned to some sort of oppressor or oppressed group. But when you look at medical education today, DEI permeates. It permeates who applies, who gets in, who gets scholarships, who gets residencies, and who goes on to get prestigious grants for medical research and so forth. We're even starting to see it permeate the licensing regime that's being advanced by this state. In essence, if you want your medical license renewed, you're going to go through 2 hours of bias training to be told that you're a racist, you're always going to be a racist, and have a nice day. This is when continuing medical education should be happening instead. The good news is that even though the folks who are in charge are pushing this down the throats through accreditation pathways and through federal funding, so many within the medical community are rejecting it because they have taken the Hippocratic Oath. They understand the importance, the enduring value of doing no harm. And that's why they come to us to say, here's what's happening at my institution. If I speak up, I may not be here tomorrow, but we can give you this information. You can speak up on our behalf and do something, whether that be with awareness, with lawsuits, with legislation. So things are tough. It's definitely dangerous, definitely a challenge, but I am more convinced every day that people are ready to do something to get DEI out of medicine.
That's great. Thank you. Welcome, Nikki.
Thank you. Sorry.
We've covered law schools, medical schools. I was going to toss it to Jay to maybe say a few words about colleges of ed and any other framing remarks.
Sure, thanks. So as Lindsay said, I was a professor at an ed school for 16 years before coming to Heritage. And at first, if people told me that ed schools were radical places indoctrinating teachers who would be indoctrinating our children in DEI radical ideology, I would not have believed it. I didn't believe it at first. And I didn't believe it because mostly what I saw were former teachers training future teachers. And I figured, oh, that radical stuff, that's only, maybe that's at Harvard Ed School or Stanford, but not in state universities that train the vast majority of teachers. But I was wrong. And I also knew that Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed was the most assigned book in ed school. I knew that Dewey was universally assigned, but I also knew that no one was reading it. I understand what people sometimes mistakenly say, the most read book in ed school. That is not true. It's the most assigned. I don't think the professors have read it, honestly. Have you seen the professors in ed school? I don't think they have. But what I missed was that you don't actually have to get everyone to read, understand, and believe something to spread a radical ideology. What you have to do is get people willing to accept others who do read it and believe it. And that's what happened in ed school, was that it normalized these radical ideas so that a relatively small number of radicals could spread it within ed schools and then carry that out into K-12 schools, and the teachers would just compliantly accept it, not object. And now that's hopeful. That means that we can win it back because they're not deep believers in this. And I have some data to back this up. So we actually did a study, Madison Marino here, where we looked at how much this has spread into K-12 schools. We looked for every school district with at least 15,000 students in it to see if they had a chief diversity officer. We found that now 48% of districts have a chief diversity officer. So this DEI ideology has spread from ed schools out into the K-12 schools. We also found that pandemic learning loss was significantly greater for minority students in the districts that had a chief diversity officer. So it was educationally counterproductive in addition to spreading very far. Also, another study that Jason Bedrick and I did recently for Heritage, where we looked at where former campus radicals go to work when they graduate. Like, you see them marching around chanting genocidal slogans, and you figure, oh, they're going to, end up in their mother's basement. And so, we can hope that that's where it ends. But actually, they get jobs. And so we tracked their LinkedIn and various resumes to find out where they were now, based on a set of radicals identified by Canary Mission. And we found that the largest number, the plurality, 38%, were in education. That's where they go. They go from being radicals on campus chanting genocidal slogans to being the individual radicals in the K-12 schools with the fellow teachers who've had their immune system suppressed by hearing the words pedagogy of the oppressed, and that's how it spread out. So I was wrong at first in thinking this wasn't really a problem. It's a very big problem, and I think we've now been documenting it. But I'm hopeful that we can turn it around because the teachers are not deep believers in this radical ideology. If we can just get rid of the spread of the agitators, I think we can reverse this.
Well, Jay is rarely wrong, so it tells you how bad the problem's gotten. If he's reversing
first,
yeah, right.
So I'm wrong all the time, I guess.
Nikki, welcome.
Thank you. I'm so sorry. I'm coming from the Hill, so I apologize for that. You know, higher ed is fascinating because it has been living rent-free inside conservatives' heads for so long, right? I mean, you think back to William F. Buckley's Scott and Mann at Yale, Alan Bloom's Closing the American Mind. And, you know, while all of us kind of like to bitch and moan about this, we all still send our kids to college. And so we're really not doing anything to break this cycle. And so this is kind of an intervention. I mean, I think back to the early 2010s when controversial graduation speakers like Christine Lagarde of the IMF or Condoleezza Rice, former Secretary of State, were canceled from speaking at graduation ceremonies, and how much, you know, we thought, like, it can't get worse than that. It has gotten worse. Oh, my gosh. And I think back to even, you know, FIRE used to track this. They had a cancellation tracker. And then when those numbers started to drop off, the Niskanen Center released a paper, and they said, well, look, the campus free speech crisis is over. No, it's not over. It's just that students stopped engaging on these issues. Students stopped inviting interesting speeches, and so speech was being chilled. And that's sadly thanks to a really well-designed and intentionally designed web of regulations and policies that really just silence students, right? You have a Star Chamber hearing of a bias response team here. You have few $1,000s of security fees there. You have, you know, no contact orders that are being issued. And then suddenly it's just easier for a lot of students, right? They're generally logical actors, just to, you know, they're just not have an interesting speaker. Let's just have someone who's very milquetoast, or just kind of have we'll do our bake sale in the end. And that's sad because that's not a real educational experience. You know, and we joke a lot, I think, about how students today are being taught what to think and not how to think, but students very clearly receive the message from these campus administrations. You know, speak up, challenge campus orthodoxy, and the mob will come for you too. And, you know, students are responding accordingly. So I think, you know, who or what has been driving these problems on campus? We are living in a horror movie. The call is coming from inside the house. It is coming from these DEI administrators. These are the ones who are driving all these policies. You know, I think back to, you know, we're the heritage, right? I have to quote Reagan. Closest thing to eternal life is a government policy. These DEI administrators have skin in the game. Never will they collect statistics and say, hey, guys, the number of hate incidents on campus has dropped off. Let's cut some staff. Let's have a smaller budget next year. They will never say that. And that's why we have watched the definition of hate and bias and intolerance and microaggressions grow and grow and grow over the years, because they have to, because they need more money. And, you know, the fact that I think once we kind of recognize that, then we can do something about it. Let's think back to in 2020 when Secretary DeVos released her Title IX revisions, reining in, actually putting in guardrails, respecting the First Amendment, respecting due process, all those things we like. Who was screaming the loudest? Who was screaming bloody murder? It was the Title IX administrators themselves, right? It was Atixa who was saying, oh my gosh, there's no way we can comply with this. I mean, think in May 2020, there was not a single human being on an educational campus, higher ed or K-12 across the country, because it was the height of COVID. And they still said, there's no way we can comply with this in 10 weeks. How dare you? I mean, come on, guys. Like, what are you doing? You know, and even looking both at K-12 schools as well as universities, I mean, what is happening would make Bull Connor's heart swell with pride, right? We have racially segregated affinity groups. We have racially segregated graduation ceremonies, segregated dorms on the basis of gender identity. What are you doing right now? And, you know, we have people who are being paid to throw up those walls and those divisions between people, and it's appalling. So with all that being said, you know, I think the past 5 months after October 7th really laid bare the rot at the heart of academia. And I think this has been a real wake-up call both for students as well as parents who are paying these bills, alumni who have just been turning over their checks blindly year over year. I had a great time going to football block, you know, in 2002. But, you know, I think looking at in the wake of that dumpster fire hearing that Congress had with all those Ivy League schools, let's remember, the first Band-Aid that was proposed by those administrations when they were trying to do damage control was, we're going to make a committee. We're going to actually add a little bit of DEI programming on anti-Semitism. It wasn't actually looking in the mirror and saying, wow, we screwed up. And so the problem, and this is, I think Jason Bedwick has always said this so beautifully, the problem is not that, oops, DEI administrators miscoded Jews as oppressors when really they're oppressed, or even thinking back to the Students for Fair Admissions decision, it wasn't that, oops, Asians were miscoded as oppressors when really they're oppressed. It's that we have our tax dollars being used to code people at all, period. This is not a redeemable endeavor. We look at, just kind of taking a step back, looking at higher ed across the board, mental health problems are up. Kids are graduating, 5, 6, 7 years at a cost of $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 a year. People are consigned to a lifetime of poverty, and they're not actually learning anything right now. So if this is what the billions of dollars that have been spent over the past 10, 20, 30 years on university-level DEI programs has wrought, I think it's time for America to admit we bought a lemon, and it's time to cut off these programs entirely.
Excellent. Nicely put. So Sarah, I'm going to throw out a question to each of you. On law schools, what can we do about it? It sounds like the ABA is maybe the crux of the problem.
Yeah, since 1952, it's been the sole accrediting authority for American law schools. We need to divest the ABA, again, a voluntary membership organization with its sole accrediting authority. This has real impact. In fact, at Yale Law School, there are more administrators than there actually are professors of law, many of whom are DEI administrators. That's driving up the cost of law school, which in turn is driving up the cost of the billable hour, and 80% of Americans can't afford legal representation in the country. So DEI has a real-world impact on how people receive justice in courts around the country. So we've got to divest the American Bar Association with its sole authority. We need state legislators and state Supreme Courts to determine what is tantamount to a good legal education in that state in order to sit for the bar. The states know best anyway. We really need to get the ABA out of law schools.
And Christina, we were talking before this about how even if you have a state that puts good reforms in place, the federal grants that you alluded to earlier can really tie their hands. What does that look like? What can we do about it at the federal level?
Yeah, I'm pretty convinced that the next administration is going to need an equality czar to come in and go agency by agency, yank the equity rules that are destroying this country, and replace equality at the center of everything that we do. So much can be done. Let's start with the students themselves. If there is a scholarship that is explicitly discriminating on the basis of race, no whites, no Asians, the students really can do something in a very unique way. And this comes in part from the Students for Fair Admissions decision, where the students who were able to challenge that did that anonymously by joining a membership organization, and then the membership association carried the case forward. So for every white or Asian student or any other race that is being illegally barred from applying for a fellowship or scholarship, please reach out to us. We would love to see if we can get you representation. And you can do it quietly so you can continue on with your studies, but make sure that these schools back down. Short of that, we've been filing Office for Civil Rights complaints left and right, and we're seeing that medical schools are changing the eligibility so that they are not being allowed to discriminate on the basis of race. State legislators need to be doing a lot by way of oversight. Many of these universities are land grant entities that are literal creations of the state. They have a lot to say with regards to how they are operating. Same thing with governors can go in and make sure that the institutions are living up to their original promise. And of course, the professors themselves also can do a lot to resist some of these terrible ideas. If you're told, if you're applying for tenure and you need to submit a diversity statement, don't do it and make a stink about it if they try to call you on it. Don't go along. We heard a lot during the Trump administration about #resist. Well, when you're actually resisting evil, it's a good thing. And we're seeing that in too many instances here. So much can be done. The good news is that Americans just want doctors who can treat and cure their family. So in terms of a market audience for your customers wanting you just to go study kidneys rather than colonialism, you've got the American people on your side. So stand up.
That's a good slogan, kidneys, not colonialism. Yeah, do that. Jay, this might be a bit of a curveball, but I'm confident you can handle it. How is this manifesting in the K-12 classroom? If you're a teacher steeped in DEI from your College of Ed, what might you be doing within the four walls of your classroom to perpetuate it?
So it is a curveball, but no, that's fine. So it used to be that most instruction was guided by textbooks, and teachers would kind of just teach in the order of the textbook. And even if the teacher wasn't great, or didn't have particularly good judgment about what to emphasize, the textbook would guide them in what to do. And the textbooks weren't great either, mind you, but it was better. Now, what teachers are doing is they're grabbing materials from online at will. And there's no particular order to what they do, and it's whatever they wish to find. So what's happening, the way DEI is manifesting in the classroom, is that the kinds of things they're picking are things that they think satisfy DEI goals. That is, things that emphasize a narrative of oppressor and oppressed, that justify differential treatment of people based on their group's status. Those are the kinds of lessons that they will find, and they will find it in every subject. So you can find it as easily in science, biology, chemistry, as you can in history or in English, because people have produced these materials, put them up online for teachers to grab. And those are the ones they think they're supposed to be grabbing, and those are the ones they're teaching. I would also just, one quick addition to Christina's, just a shout out for John Saylor has a piece today in the Wall Street Journal on how the National Institute of Health is actually pushing DEI into medical research. So that would be something that Christina's equality czar would get rid of. But I think everyone should be aware that that piece is out today.
That's great. And quick follow-up, you mentioned with these chief diversity officers, we don't see an impact on improved academic outcomes. What about school climate? Surely school climate's better. Is there an association?
No, so actually test scores are worse where you have a chief diversity officer. So they're academically counterproductive. Why that's happening? Because they push ideas that actually undermine the effort of the teachers and students to learn as much as they can, because they provide ready narratives about failure and excuses for failure. So, so that, I'm sorry, what was the school climate. Oh, school climate. So we did find, however, that where chief diversity officers are present, you're more likely to have a gender secret policy. So Nikki's organization, Parents Defending Education, has this fantastic tracker of school districts that have policies in place to keep secrets from parents about the gender of their children as a matter of policy, okay? And where you have a chief diversity officer in a school district, you're more likely to have that policy. So that's something they're pushing. So if you don't like the learning loss, you'll love the keeping secrets from you. That's what diversity gives. Chief diversity officers give you.
So that's a great segue, Nikki. This panel is about seizing the moments, about solutions. The whole day is, in fact. So, I mean, with PDE, you are shining a spotlight on DEI and everything adjacent to it. What else can we think about in terms of how we actually defeat this pernicious ideology moving forward?
I'm sure it'll come up later in the corporate panel, but I think we're also at a starve the beast moment, right? I mean, I live in Arlington Public Schools, which last year, I think when we voted, took out another $100 million bond initiative, right? Even though, there are fewer students in classrooms across the board. And so the fact that this is what districts are choosing to spend their finite money on is appalling. And think about, interest rates are going up and up and up and up. And so why are we spending money on untested programs that either don't work or frankly are producing absolutely negative outcomes? This is a moment in time when we've seen corporations say, we're going to cut that department. This is the time for districts to be doing the same thing as well. When I was running Speech First, when we sued the University of Michigan in 2018, they had, Mark Perry at AEI had identified that there were 92 diversity employees at the University of Michigan system. I think I recently saw it's up to it's north of 200 at this point. And so even though we crushed them in the Sixth Circuit, awesome, we also, the fact that they are still continuing to add and add and add. I mean, in 2018, for 92 people, it was a cost of $11 million just in salary and benefits, not programming, anything else. How many full-ride scholarships could you offer? How much targeted tutoring could you offer to students on the basis of that? I mean, we're watching all these equity warriors that are screaming from the rooftops about the benefits of their programming. We are watching, the NAEP scores that came out post-pandemic. were astonishing. The students who lost the most were the most disadvantaged students. They don't care about those children. They don't care about these students being able to graduate with a degree that will actually get them a job. I mean, I think I saw recently that 52% of students are underemployed right now. They're not using their degree for something. And so if my child is graduating with $350,000 in student loans from like a tier 4 school, and then they can't get a job, they will never be able to get out from under that burden. That is criminal what our education system is doing to these students. And so I think really just, I mean, not everyone is as brave as everybody in this panel to take on kind of the DEI industrial complex head on. But they will say, you know what, I don't know if this is a good use of money. I think there are ways even to give kind of cover for people to speak out and say, you know what, maybe let's do something else with the PTA money this year instead of hiring, or doing another kind of divisive program.
So that's a good point, right? I mean, and I would welcome anybody to weigh in on this, but with regard to the hearing, with regard to everything that we're seeing with DEI, I mean, have universities sufficiently tarnished themselves that families are rethinking the whole value proposition of higher ed? Christina?
There's an interesting YouTube clip, and it shows the University of Minnesota's white coat ceremony a couple of years ago, where the students traditionally recite a pledge focused on, good medicine, taking care of people. The University of Minnesota rewrote it, and it was just a shocking display of radical ideology, one line after the other. And the students are kind of mumbling through it, but if you look at the audience, the family members, the loved ones, they're kind of going like, wait, what are they saying? Like, what are these doctors pledging to respect and so forth? And so to me, I took that as an indicator that there is this pushback, that if you're going to go to medical school, that you're actually going to come out a great doctor, able to help and cure people, and you can get a job or pay that money back. So I do think there's an increasing level of frustration with what are we getting? How good will my doctor be? And that's the moment to seize the advantage and push forward.
I want to add to that a little bit, because the ABA is doing something right now in terms of now saying you don't need the LSAT to get into law school for accreditation. So, you can welcome it for your own purposes if you think it's a good indicator. But as a general rule, we're not going to require it. So you're automatically sort of dumbing down the intellectual character of individuals who are getting into law school. And Texas Public Policy Foundation 2 years ago did an assessment of all higher ed degrees, and it was considered, the law degree, to be the riskiest of all higher education investments, because value for input versus value for employment does not match up. And I am a woman of a certain age who has just finished off paying her law school debt. Let me tell you, it is the most expensive higher education degree you can get right now. And in increasing measure, we're seeing that it's not worth it. I am hearing more and more from kids who are in my children's classes saying, I'm not going to college, I'm going to go into the trade. So I think it is gaining a little bit of traction.
That's great.
So we think of universities as awash in money, and they are. But they spend every dollar they get and more. And they have no capacity to cut. They have no idea how to do that. And so Harvard, which has a $53 billion endowment, I believe, actually has an annual operating budget of in excess of $5 billion. They need every penny they can get. And they've come up short here. Clearly, they've come up short because they're now issuing a bond for about $2 billion, because they're short on cash. Most of their endowment is actually in illiquid investments, and so they're feeling the squeeze. They also had a decline in the number of early admission applications. Now, look, don't get me wrong. Harvard has a lot of resources to fall back on and isn't going to collapse tomorrow, but they are feeling the heat. And if you hit them with the money, they will change. And if you take some heads, so getting some presidents out, that also will produce change, because then bureaucrats who don't care about DEI, but who have done it because they think that's the way to rise up, will abandon it. So I think part of how we're making progress is we're taking heads and taking money, and it's producing success.
I think it's also worth noting that we're seeing universities now start to quietly reinstate the merit applications, right, with like the bringing in the test scores again, where that was out of fashion for a while. It was not equitable. And then they realized these students were getting in and they were failing out, and that's bad across the board. And so they actually want students to get into their student body who belong there.
Can you, as somebody who is on the front lines, really, of the Students for Fair Admissions fight, can you talk about maybe the intersection between that decision, DEI, and whether or not universities are going to comply willingly, or what we could see in the wake of that?
I mean, it was so fun. Even, right, I mean, the argument was on Halloween in 2022, and then the next 6 months of that, after that, were all these, you know, I mean, verklempt articles in Inside Higher Ed and all these places saying, oh, here's how we deal with SFFA after we lose, right? They knew they were going to lose. And then they were trying to figure out what are the proxies we can use, right? And so we just saw this happen in Fairfax with Coalition for TJ. What are ways we can get at race without actually getting at race, right? And so this is the hill that these guys are going to die on, absolutely. I think, you know, my hope is that maybe on some of the gender things that they've overreached, but I think on the race segregation, they are absolutely, you know, they're all in on this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, the workarounds are happening. You see emails from general counsel saying, come to us before you put something up. We'll help you get to the same place, but do it in a legal way, right? They are being very creative on this front. So take nothing for granted. We're also starting to see in some of the red states, the DEI office gets renamed, you know, the Office of Belonging and Inclusion and so forth. And so you have to stay on top of it because there's a lot of ways to wiggle out of it. And that's why groups like the Heritage Foundation and all the groups here are doing such important work to make that happen.
Yeah. What worries me, honestly, is watching them push these programs to lower and lower ages because for children, right, it's very much exploiting a power dynamic between teachers and children, right? When you're, I mean, and I think many of us have worked with Turning Point and Young America's Foundation and groups like that where, you know, there are 18-year-olds who have principles and values and a spine that they learn from their families. But when you do that to an 8-year-old, when you do that to a 7-year-old, even if you say this affinity group is open to everyone, you know, no 8-year-old is going to say, all right, I'm going to go to the Asian one even though I'm not Asian, right? I mean, it's really starting to bake that thought process in, and I think that's one of the reasons why, you know, PDE, we try and address those programs very early on because I think it's really disgusting what they're doing to children because they are brainwashing them.
Just quickly, there's a Dismantle DEI tracker on the Heritage website. Perhaps we can put up online the exact web address. But there are state bills moving, and I know all the people here are involved in working on those bills to dismantle DEI bureaucracies in state educational institutions. And you can keep track of where those bills have passed, where they've been proposed, where they have not yet been proposed. And these trackers are quite handy for knowing where it is that you might want to be focusing some of your energy if you're fighting against DEI.
Great, thanks for mentioning that. We've got 1 minute left. Final thoughts from the group?
Such pressure.
I only get like 20 seconds of that 1 minute, so.
I think it's really important to remember that racism by any other name is still racism, whether you call it diversity, equity, and inclusion, or whether you call it belonging. And there are so many opportunities for higher education to infuse racist principles into what should be a neutral relationship between teacher and student all the way across the board, starting in K through 12 and going all the way through the graduate programs. And unfortunately, it changes how we practice everything from law to medicine to teaching. And I think really it requires a lot of boldness. Nadine Strawson, the first female head of the ACLU, not a paragon of conservatism, says she is now self-censoring in her law school classes because she is so afraid of student blowback. That is the effect that we are seeing now in higher education. So it really is important to speak up, just as Christina said.
It's a see something, say something moment. If you're seeing this creep into your place of education or employment, don't just take it laying down. If you don't feel like you can speak up by yourself, please come to any of our organizations. Do No Harm would love to help people in the medical healthcare space speak up and push back. Otherwise, the bulldozer will keep moving forward.
And I think, you know, at the end of the day, courage is contagious. We have seen just over the past 5 years so many average people, right? Like stay-at-home moms who would never have, you know, they're not political, they're Democrats. I mean, we have people who come to us through our tip line all the time. And they really are, I think, are in this, you know, if not me, then who, if not now, then when moment. Because they have realized that all of the traditional gatekeepers who we have assumed had our children's best interest at heart, had our best interest at heart, do not. They care about their money and their power. And so people are saying, you know what? I know that there will be blowback. Come at me. It's worth it. And so I think, you know, to that end, I would urge all of you in this audience to continue to use your voices and your platforms.
Well, thank you for all of your work at Parents Defending Education. Christina, all of your work at Do No Harm. And thank you, Sarah and Jay, for all of your work at Heritage. Please join me in thanking our panelists.
Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome. I'll extend my warmth to you all in the audience. It's a little chilly in the room. I hope you who are online and joining us are in a little bit more comfortable position. I'm freezing here. I love the opening remarks from Mike Gonzalez and this Burgess Owens and Eric Tietzel were just fantastic in setting the foundation for the previous panel. And now we're going to move into DEI in the military. My name is John Venable. I go by JV. I spent a little time in the Air Force, and then for the last 8 or so years, I've been here as a senior research fellow at the Heritage Foundation. I'd like to take a quick moment to introduce this strikingly handsome panel over here to you. First, closest to me is Earl Matthews, and Earl Matthews is a former acting general counsel for the United States Army under the Trump administration, and he is currently a judge advocate for the United States Army Reserve. Right next to him is Amber Smith. Now, we have a lot of vernacular and terms that I'll introduce you to if you're not familiar in the military. Amber is a former rotor head. She is a Kiowa warrior pilot, command pilot, and also led air missions throughout Iraq and Afghanistan through her tours of duty in the United States Army. She is a former Deputy Assistant Secretary for Outreach out of the Pentagon. And she's currently a consultant and author here in the D.C. area. And she's got a book that's coming out, Unfit to Fight, How Woke Policies Are Destroying Our Military. And that'll be out within the next month, but you can pre-order it right now if you're so interested on Amazon. And last but not least is that dapper Will Thibault over there. And Will is a former 75th Ranger Regiment officer, so former Ranger in the United States Army, and he's currently with the Claremont Institute as a defense analyst and policy maker there. So please take a minute to welcome our panel, and I'll sit down and join them. So we heard this morning Burgess talk about how he viewed DEI as cancer that's infused throughout the society right now. And our previous panel talked about how it had infiltrated into education, into the legal framework, and into the medical society and educational process there. We're going to talk about how it has actually hit the military now. We've seen telltale signs throughout society. If you look at the industry right now, the CHIPS Act that's trying to get those semiconductors made in the United States is kind of stalled because of the DEI injects that have been inserted into that, making it really challenging for us to get the personnel that are really qualified into that. So that's industry. A couple of other insights that we can go over throughout this morning's conversation. But how do we know that it's injected and it's affecting the United States military now?
I can start. We know that because it started in the military. In the Civil Rights era, Secretary Robert McNamara during the Johnson and the Kennedy and Johnson administrations explicitly stated that the military would be the leading edge of diversity, equity, inclusion as we know it now, but affirmative action then, a rights-based quota regime based on race in the 60s that's continued and now based on sex. And that is the essence of it. It's not, the drag shows we see on aircraft carriers or the books in military libraries. It's the fact that throughout the military, starting at the Office of the Secretary of Defense, continuing at places like West Point and the Air Force, those military institutions have quotas that mandate proportional representation in those units and even in the department writ large, based on not your zip code or your income level growing up, but your race or your sex. And that's the essence of why diversity, equity, inclusion is so bad, why it's started in the military, and gives us the starting point of what policies need to change once the right people are in positions of power to do it. But we should look no further than those quotas that undermine the merit that the military exists to continue.
And I would say that DEI is extremely prevalent throughout military culture, and we see it at the lowest level all the way up to the highest level. And it is now to the point where it's no longer trying to be hidden by senior leaders. It is something that is openly talked about. And what is interesting is for some senior leaders, the acceptance and the willing to almost embrace it and publicly speak about it as if it's something that is going to make us better. We saw General Milley testify in front of Congress saying that he, as a white man, wants to understand what white rage is all about. You see classes taught at West Point called whiteness and white rage, and how people, cadets, these future military leaders leading our troops in battle and future conflicts, how they need to learn about these issues. It's creating weak leaders, and it is creating a divisiveness that is absolutely damaging to the military as a whole for an organization that runs on cohesion and morale and teamwork. And it is at every single level. And then back to my point about the senior leaders and how they are addressing it. Some are openly embracing it. Some are almost playing dumb and acting like they don't know what the big deal is. You see the Secretary of the Army, when asked about is woke policies what is damaging the recruitment numbers, and she openly says, I don't know what woke means. What does woke mean? How is something that isn't affecting the military causing these recruitment numbers to change? So you've got two sort of fronts: the denial of some senior leaders, and on the other hand, you have full acceptance and embracing it.
Well, JP, I'll say that bottom line is that the core mission of the Department of Defense, and especially the Army, is to fight and win our nation's wars. It's about winning in a battlefield, being prepared to fight and win across any domain of warfare, and that's what we should be focused on. Now, in terms of diversity, I mean, I really don't. The military doesn't. The military has been nationally diverse for decades, right? I mean, Truman got rid of the segregation in the military in 1948. Now, we've had our struggles, but the military has led in terms of the advancement of all people based on merit. There's a reason. I believe we need to return to equal opportunities military as opposed to a so-called DEI model, where you're focusing on differences as opposed to the military seeks uniformity and conformity. So it doesn't matter if you're a black kid from the ghettos of Philadelphia or from Detroit, or you're from a white kid from rural Alabama. You guys meet at basic training, and you become friends and comrades, and you go to war together. And so we don't want racial division, balkanization. Focus on our differences versus what makes us as a cohesive force. And so you want to focus on those things which unite us: common values, common belief in our Constitution, common belief in destroying the enemy when we go to war. That's what we need to focus on. Now, we're all of us are Army officers, I'm still in the reserve. I'm speaking for myself, by the way, not for DOD. And Will and Amber are both Army officers. We all served in combat overseas. We've seen that people of different races work together. They're friends. They don't need artificial ideologies or postmodern theories to make them more cohesive. And I think many of these ideologies are, I think they're driven by political motivations, social motivations outside of the military context. And so I think that's what we should be mindful of. So bottom line is we need to fight and win our wars. In terms of, equal opportunity, we came from an era that there was a segregated army. I'm named after my grandfather. My name's Earl Matthews. He was Earl Matthews. He was a corporal in the Army. I'm a colonel. He served in the segregated Army. Both of his sons served in the desegregated military in Vietnam. So we made progress in our country and our military. And so I think that does the military really have a diversity problem? I don't think so. I mean, in terms of equity, equity is not something that we desire in the military. We don't want predetermined outcomes. We want to provide we want to provide equality of opportunity, not necessarily equality of outcome. And so that's where the disconnect lies with what the current left-wing ideologies are promoting right now.
Yeah, I love that line. One of the things you said that I'd like to dwell on just for a minute is cohesion and building cohesion into units. One of the things that you do when you come in the military is the military actually breaks down the individual and forces them to meld into a cohesive unit. And DEI, one of its tenets is basically to drive individualism back into the forefront of the conversation, which absolutely dismantles that cohesion.
Of course. I mean, in the 60s, the Marine Corps used to say, we have light green Marines or dark green Marines, but we're all Marines. We're all green Marines. And so we have to, and what they meant by that is they adopt the Marine Corps ethos, the warrior ethos, and the and the principles, courage, honor, and commitment. Focus, whether I'm a black Army officer, a white Army officer is going to have the same values you would think, the belief in the Constitution, belief in the Army values. That's what people have to buy in. There shouldn't be a focus on demographic backgrounds. I mean, we curate opportunity. We don't want to disadvantage anyone based on their race or advantage anyone based on their race. And that's the principle we need to go back to.
And part of that cohesion is a mutual purpose and a mutual mission. And that is what the military used to be about. It was mission focused, mission centric, where that is what your life in the military revolved around, was how are we going to train? How are we going to build each other as a team? How are we going to work together to accomplish the mission? And then once we've got that, how we're going to maintain that military readiness. How are we going to be ready for what's next? And what we've seen with DEI principles is the division that comes with that, and saying that a group of you are oppressors, a group of you are victims, and now we're not on the same team because that's what we're focused on. Instead of us being like, yeah, we come from every single different background that you could possibly imagine. It literally doesn't matter if you grew up in the poorest part of America without your parents, or the richest side, and you had all the opportunities with college and everything else in the world, and you still chose to serve your country. You join the military, nobody cares anymore about your background. You all have the same mission, the same responsibilities, and you're going to rely on your team to ensure that you're able to accomplish that mission. That is what is so hard for most people who have served in the mission or served in the military, to watch and see that cohesiveness and that trust, especially between leaders and their subordinates, that relationship that is absolutely critical for success on the battlefield, for that trust and confidence, be destroyed. Because that's not something that gets to be turned on and off like a light switch. So once it's destroyed, that's going to take a very long time to rebuild.
The other thing is the DEI policies seem to advantage or elevate every group out there except straight white males, and that's a problem because it creates balkanization. I mean, when you create a military unit and organization, again, it's about cohesion. It's about accentuating the things we have in common as American citizens, as sons and daughters of our country who want to serve our country and win our nation's wars. But when you say one group is an oppressor, that's problematic. It may discourage someone from signing up or re-enlisting. Now, it's funny because in the military, in terms of, they're promoting DEI policies when, retention rates for minorities are higher than whites in the armed forces of the United States. Whites and blacks equally, or other minorities, command. I mean, black folks manage white people historically in the military, at higher rates than any other sector of American society. So that was before these DEI concepts came about. So I question the necessity of some of these policies and what's really driving them.
Just one thing, JV. You hear the trope from increasingly higher ranked military officers that our strong teams are diverse teams, which is obviously nonsense. And there's not research or experience to prove it. I can, assure you that what gives you the confidence to go, to a place where you're not welcome and fight a war is the belief that the people on the helicopter or the airplane next to you are the very best people for the job. And I do want to talk about the history, though, because Earl mentioned President Truman's executive order to integrate the Army in particular in 1948. A really interesting thing happened from 1948 to 1960 is that the Army in the 50s made a genuine effort at equal opportunity. They took race out of military personnel files. Imagine that happening today in a kindergarten classroom, much less the military. But what happened, again, thanks to Robert McNamara, President Kennedy, and Lyndon Johnson, is the military became a place where you must expect a certain proportion of representation based on innate characteristics. That also came at a time of a really complicated, tense war in Vietnam. It came at a time of conscription, and it came at a time of a civil rights crisis back home. But what you saw when you combined all that together, and that was defined by the understanding that the military must reflect society, a faulty assumption that we can get to later. When you combined all that, you got intense racial violence within the military. In 1970 alone, over 1,000 incidents of racial violence happened in the Marine Corps, just the Marine Corps, pretty small compared to the Army. There was a race riot on the USS Kitty Hawk, an aircraft carrier. A military prison in Vietnam was overrun in a race riot, because back in the day we used to need military prisons to put U.S. soldiers in when they fought wars. This was the ultimate breakdown of cohesion, but it came when you lost a sense of equal opportunity and colorblindness that they had started to try in the military, but that they lost when the military became the vanguard for a certain consumption of what people should look like in uniform.
Yeah, it's amazing what you do when you dwell on something, huh? Just for your edification, here at the Heritage Foundation for the last 10 years, we've put out what we call the Index of U.S. Military Strength. We evaluate how the services are doing. And last year, all-time low. The Navy was ranked weak, the Army was ranked weak, and the United States Air Force was ranked very weak. That means that there's an impact that's happening on the services that is detrimental to readiness, our ability to go out and fight our wars. What impact do you all think that DEI has had in that contributing to the demise of the military?
Well, I think you're focusing on attributes which have nothing to do with warfighting. I mean, there's still an effort to ban gender-specific pronouns in military awards decorations. This whole gender ideology, which really has come about because of the decision to allow transgender people to serve in the military. So we want to eliminate gender. And I think that could have a detrimental effect on people because you're living in an Orwellian world where people they can't say what reality is, right? You can't call someone a woman if they're a woman or we don't know what a woman is. So we eliminated gender in the military. It doesn't make sense, and there's no good benefit to it.
I would talk about we hear about. We're in the biggest recruitment crisis since the Vietnam War. But something that I think is worse than the recruitment crisis is the more silent retention crisis. And that is driven by these DEI policies that we see. So some of these very experienced leaders, battle-proven warriors that have priceless experience, both leading troops in combat and just military experience, the deployments, everything that comes along with that in terms of helping mentor and train that new generation of people coming into the military, have seen the old military, the one that was mission centric, and now they see this new military that is uniqueness and separating people into different categories and groups, and that is now the priority. And so many of them are turning down commands. They are just putting their head down until their ETS date comes up where they are able to separate from service and get out. People who had initial plans of retiring, going on whatever leadership track to stay in the military and serve their country, and they have seen the decline so rapidly, and they've seen what happens if you speak out against some of these policies, and the repercussions and the loss of opportunity that comes with that, and sort of wearing that brand of a DEI denier that nobody wants to carry in the military anymore. So we're seeing these people who just throw their hands up and are saying, I'm going to go along to get along until my date comes up. And that is going to be longer. They're not going to be able to throw as much money at those people who are saying it's not worth it anymore.
Well, in JV, I look at the numbers, the very limited, rarely reported numbers we get from the military to give all the evidence we need. In January, military.com had Army internal data that showed, truthfully so, that the share of white recruits, the percentage of white recruits to the Army specifically, was at its lowest level ever, and it had been steadily declining for 6 years. And, you wonder, perhaps the Army is getting more diverse. Right. The issue is, though, that Black and Hispanic recruits in particular were not increasing as a share relative to the whole that would make up for the decline in white recruits. And I actually think it's a mistake for folks like us perhaps to argue whether or not this affects recruitment. If a young man in Ohio is more or less motivated to join the military because of DEI policies, the fact is the Army's system of quotas that's established in the Deputy Secretary of Defense Directive Performance Goal 3.1.2 that mandates proportional representation and promotion based on skin color and sex are working. And they're recruiting, promoting, and otherwise hiring fewer white men. And I would take issue. I don't think the military is naturally diverse. Sadly, perhaps, and that's not something to be happy about, but it is something to accept as a reality. I served in units that were 90+% white and 99+% male. That was a factor not of discrimination, but of a selection process that, for whatever reason, produced those numbers based on who was willing to join and serve in those units in which I was so blessed to serve. But we have a crisis of end strength, and it's in part because there are quotas in place, certainly in the Army and the Air Force, that direct leaders to hire fewer people based on their skin color. That's objectionable and bad.
I would disagree with Will. I think the military is naturally diverse. You look at the Army. In the 1980s, Army was 30% Black, and that wasn't because of a quota. It was because the Army presented opportunities for people to get out of their inner city backgrounds to advance themselves. It was a way to achieve mobility in society. You look at our Colin Powell. You look at so many of our distinguished military leaders who found a way out of their circumstance by being in the military. And so I think the military is diverse. Now, the units you served in, Will, were more elite special operations units. There's a lot less minorities in those units now than there were in the past, and that's because more have gone into the logistical support elements. But so I disagree that the military is not naturally diverse.
Well, it's a fair point, and obviously the military is and should be the greatest institution of social mobility in America. It beats out college. It beats out working on Capitol Hill. If you want to leave the lower class and join the middle class, and if you want your kids to have the opportunity, to be rich one day, you join the military. And to Earl's point, there's no better place for it. What we should reject, though, is the notion that the military necessarily mirrors America in reality or in an ideal state. And you don't find that now. You don't find that military-wide. You don't find that in certain units. There are different demographics in different commands, but this belief that the military must relate at all demographically to the country, I think, is the flawed concept.
Or that it needs to.
Just a little note to inject here. A little diversity of opinion here on the panel, don't you think? I'm a little disturbed by that.
So I take my military background. I'm a guy from inner city Philadelphia, joined the Army. But my mentors have been white Southerners. They've been Japanese Americans, Jewish Americans, a Burmese American who was a general who looked out. I think the military. My experience. I've had friends from many different racial and ethnic backgrounds in the Army. I've had friends who are rabbis in the Army and guys from Mormons. I've had friends from all. So I think the military is diverse, and it does draw from a cross section of American society. So I just want to point that out.
I think where some of the on both sides of this is you hear from leaders today, like Joe Biden, like Secretary Austin, who say the military needs to look like America. And where the problem in that lies is that then removes the military from being a merit-based institution, because then you are bringing in the quotas and saying we need to ensure that the military in these certain percentages matches what America looks like. And that is a problem. The military should be comprised of the best, most amazing person for the job, regardless of the color of skin that they were born with.
I guess I'm not defending Biden or Austin by any means at all. I didn't vote for, so I used to work for President Trump and hope to work for him again. But I in terms of but the military, I mean, I want to distinguish between the enlisted and officer ranks, because the enlisted ranks are fairly diverse, Amber, as you know. I think at the top level, senior levels of the military, is less diversity at the 3 and 4 star rank. But even there, you find a lot more diversity than you would say in corporate America. So, I mean, you're a career airman, JV. You work for Black Airmen, I'm sure, or been around them and work. I mean, so that's the nature of the joint force, is that naturally exists. I mean, people want to join the military. I mean, during World War II, you had the Tuskegee Airmen. Those men wanted to serve our country. They wanted to fly, and they wanted to fight. And they're kids now from, whether they be an Indian, the grandson of or son of Indian immigrants, or Black kids from the South, or Jewish kids from Brooklyn. They want to serve our military, and they do that every day, and that happens. And so I mean, I don't think that the fact that, I mean, if you go to Paris Island, you see a Black or Hispanic drill instructor or drill sergeant. They didn't get there because of a quota. I mean, they wanted to be. I mean, my uncles served in Vietnam, as they both enlisted, volunteered, not drafted, because they wanted to be in the military, and that just naturally exists across a range of geographic or demographic backgrounds.
So let me go back just for a minute to this readiness idea and how this collective thing has impacted readiness. Last year, it was actually 2 years ago, the United States Air Force, who had screened when I was going through flight school on the order of 25 to 35% of every class for competency, they screened out 0.27% of all flight school graduates. That's 0.27%. That standard has fallen significantly. Since 2017, the United States Air Force has promoted every officer who has not gotten into legal or ethical problems all the way through the rank of major, every officer. How has this contributed, in your viewpoints and your service, how has that contributed to our readiness?
If everybody's getting promoted, there's no cause to be excellent, to strive to be the best. I mean, that's a problem there, obviously.
Yeah, I would encourage folks to read Deputy Secretary Kathleen Hicks' strategic management plan from 2022, where she and her staff lay out performance goals for every military component in the services, Army, Navy, Marine Corps, et cetera. And in it, they make explicit performance goals, again, tied not to your zip code or your income level, but tied to your race and sex. They say, Black and Hispanics must promote at this rate. Women must promote at this rate in order to guarantee a certain representation in society. And Earl is right. Like, you should never assume that a person in the military is not worth the service or not worth their promotion. I mean, it's not to weigh in on the quality of individuals. But when these kinds of quotas exists, when the kind of preferencing for women in certain positions exists, the doubt of whether or not they earned that promotion or that selection fairly exists. And that's not because of that man or woman. They're I mean, oftentimes I'm sure exceptional servants of their country. But it is the structure that's created by senior military leaders and political appointees that causes this questioning, that causes this chaos to be a part of the thing we talk about. And we talk about it because it has real effects. It has real effects that we have an army that doesn't meet end strength to fight one war, much less two.
I would say with readiness, it's when we talk about quotas, it's a distraction for readiness. So then you have leaders who are having to focus on if they're meeting all of this specific criteria with promotions, with numbers. And when it comes to women, like if you look at having to meet quotas essentially equates to having to lower some standards, especially with the physical fitness tests that we have seen. And then when it comes, if you go back to 2016, when Secretary Carter removed the ban on women serving in combat, he put out a statement, a public memo to the press he listed 7 things that talks about the integration of women into combat units. And you read it, today you would read that and be like, wow, that's pure common sense. Like, it makes sense. Women are going to be accepted through the selection process based on merit. Basically, it's going to be gender blind. The best person for the job is going to get selected. They will not receive special treatment. There will be no quotas or double standards. There will be no battle buddies. If one woman is the best woman for the job and she makes it, we're not going to have to bring in a second one so she has someone to stay with. It made sense on paper. The implementation was the exact opposite. And the leaders who were tasked with integrating women into these special operations and ground combat roles, it quickly went downhill in terms of commanders wanting to appease their higher bosses as the commanders of first. I was the first one to have a woman graduate from Ranger School under my command. I was the first one to have a Green Beret. I was the first.
We haven't had one yet. We haven't had a woman Green Beret
whatever.
Yet.
I'm just listing examples of where they are able to. They have gone through a selection, and so and I don't. There may be. Let's just say that. So anyway, my point is that having these quotas has been a distraction that has taken commander and service members' focus on accomplishing the mission away from doing their job.
That's a incredible commentary, so thank you for that. I do want to turn to recruiting specifically right now. Last year, there were 2 services that actually met their recruiting quotas. The Space Force, which is by far the smallest of all of the services, and it's still pilfering members from the other services, and the United States Marine Corps. The other 3 did not make their quotas by a significant margin. I received an email this morning from a general officer inside the Pentagon, and he referred to the recruiting crisis as an existential threat to all of the services. What impact is DEI having on recruiting?
Yeah, I mean, I'll jump in. I don't necessarily think it's a question of recruiting as in the motivation of Americans to serve, although the American Principles Project surveyed veterans, over a third of whom don't want their children to serve. And that's significant when you understand that 80% of service members come from veterans' families. And the biggest reason, by an order of 70% or more, the biggest reason why those veterans don't want their families to serve is because of politicized military leaders. Perception that military leaders don't care about the lethality of the force, but they care about politics and a certain political vision for the country. But again, this recruiting crisis is self-inflicted. We've been told not to hire certain kinds of Americans, and the military isn't doing so, and so we don't have enough Americans to serve in the military. It's quite as simple as that, and we shouldn't let the military establishment or the Democrats in Congress convolute the matter.
Also, we tell our fellow citizens that our country is fundamentally racist, fundamentally flawed. Why would you want to serve your country? Why would you, if it's that bad? I mean, even in a time of segregation and discrimination, legalized discrimination, we promoted American values, Americanism, and we promoted American ideals and taught people about the greatness of our country and the promise of our country. Now we downgrade America, and that we pay a price for that. We demonize service. We demonize the flag. We don't want to say the Pledge of Allegiance or stand for the national anthem. Who would want to serve? I mean, some of us still do, but it's something that we got to reinforce: patriotism, American values, love of country, inculcate that. And I joined the military because I wanted to be part of something bigger than myself, to put service before self. And I think that's probably why you joined JV and why all of us joined. So I think that we've got to reemphasize Americanism, our commonality, the greatness of our country. We've had our struggles, our problems, but we're still the greatest country in the world. We got to, somebody's got to defend us. Somebody's got to be willing to die for us. But our job as soldiers is not to die for our country, but to make the other guy die for his country. And so that's what I believe.
When I worked at the Pentagon, a lot of what I focused on was the civilian-military divide and connecting the American people with those who serve. And to sort of go over what Will said in terms of parents and family members not recommending service to their children anymore, one of the biggest, the Pentagon actually relies on veterans as recruiters in a sense, and that is a significant demographic for them of new recruits, is people who have a direct family member, extended family member, some connection to the military, someone close to them who is promoting service. That is not happening anymore. And so when we see those massive numbers in terms of the services missing their numbers, and it's getting worse almost every single year, that they're missing out on that entire demographic of people who have served in the recent military and are seeing what it's become and are not recommending to it. I recently did a bunch of research for my book that's coming out, and I interviewed dozens of active duty or recent veterans in the military. And throughout my interview, I asked them the same last question, and it was, would you recommend service to your children, or would you recommend it to children close to you or family, extended family members, young Americans who are interested? And I did not have one say yes to me. And these are high-performing people, good experiences in the military, and then they had this exposure to what the military has become, and it was no hesitation, absolutely not. I had one person say, maybe the Air National Guard, maybe, and that was a maybe. Everybody else said no, and that is very dangerous for a military who can't even use veterans anymore as the what used to be a heavily relied on demographic to get future recruits.
Just a quick answer. We're running out of time here, but I'm turning that question to the three of you. Family member asks you, would you recommend that I go into the United States Army? Yes or no?
No.
I'm never going to pull the drawbridge up behind me, because serving in the Army has given me everything good that I've known in my life. And I've got, 15 and 18 years, 15 and 17 years until my sons will have that decision to make. But we have to make it an institution that's worth it, because there's no other place where boys can become men, and that's why these conversations are so important. So it's a dodge.
I will say real quick, just since I only give a one-word answer, that was incredibly hard for me to come to that decision, because I have been speaking on this issue for over a decade, and I have been the strongest advocate for people to join the military. I have encouraged it. And so I think for me to come to that point where absolutely not, as the military stands today with the current leadership that we have, that's how I came to my answer as no.
We're just about out of time, so.
I'll just say one thing. So elections, a fish rots from the head, right? So elections have consequences. So who our national leaders are matters. And so, I think if we had a different leadership right now at the Pentagon, we may have different priorities than we do now. And so that's something the American people need to consider also.
Well, very grateful for your thoughts and your willingness to come up on the stage and talk about your experiences. Thank you. And thank you, audience, for being with us. We've got one more panel that's coming up. They're not quite as good looking as this panel, but Jonathan Butcher's going to bring them up right now. Would you give these people a round of applause?
Well, definitely not as good looking, but the only ones with at least one bow tie. So we've got to get some points for that. So thank you so much. If you could please join me once more in thanking our last panel and for their service to our country. So good morning, and thank you for staying with us this morning, and welcome to our last panel in this event talking about seizing the moment and defeating DEI. We've had several speakers talk about this issue, so I'd like to take just a moment to warm things up for my panel, although they will not need it, but it's going to help to connect some of the dots about what's been discussed so far, because we've covered a lot here, right? We've talked about the military, we've talked about free speech on campus, we've talked about anti-Semitism. Very quickly, so how does all of this bring us back to the topic of so-called diversity, equity, and inclusion? Well, let me point to a couple of examples here of why DEI really is at the center of it. So when Nikki Neely was up here on the stage talking about her time at Speech First, when they filed a lawsuit against the University of Michigan, that was against their bias response team on campus, which allowed for anonymous reports of being offended by something you heard or saw on campus. Well, that has to do with DEI because the DEI staff on college campuses run bias response teams, right? So don't miss this connection here, right? They are the ones often behind or employed by or operating BRTs. Same kind of thing here can be levied at DEI and the connection with anti-Semitism, right? So with the awful incidents that we've seen of anti-Semitic acts since October 7th last fall, where are the DEI offices? The ones that claim to be standing for diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? Ostensibly tolerance, ostensibly a healthier culture on campuses. Where have they been to help resolve these? When in fact, the issues of self-censorship, the issues of students not willing to speak up on campus, and obviously the incidents of anti-Semitism, they've all gotten worse, right? They've gotten worse, especially over the last decade. So as we move into this last panel, I'm going to start us with three things, and then I'm going to take a seat and introduce each one of our panelists, and we'll have a conversation about what's going on. So first, DEI doesn't work. It doesn't work to do what it says it's going to do in the business context. We've had hundreds, if not thousands, of studies asking DEI training participants what they think after they undergo DEI training. They either haven't changed their opinion, or they feel resentful of having to have gone through it, or their opinion hasn't changed at all, or there's no evidence. So DEI is not even doing what it says it's going to do. Second, it hasn't stopped anti-Semitism. It hasn't stopped and made businesses and schools more diverse or tolerant, right? And we can see that from the examples that you read in the headlines every day. And then finally, nothing will actually satisfy the radicals, either on campus or especially in the philanthropic world. In some research that I did last year, when you actually look at what the radicals will say in writing in things like the magazine called Inside Philanthropy, they look at the new DEI statements or the anti-racist statements, and they say that it's not enough, right? They're not pleased with all of these things that businesses have done to tie themselves in knots around DEI. They're just not satisfied, and they say flatly that philanthropy is falling short in its effort to support BIPOC-led and BIPOC-serving organizations, right? They're not satisfied with what they've done. So, as that gets us a little bit of momentum going into our final panel, let me introduce each of these gentlemen on my left. First, and closest to me, Andy Alavastro is the Chief Advancement Officer for Heritage, overseeing development and outreach portfolios. He's on his fourth tour of duty at Heritage. Prior, Andy led communications, corporate responsibility, and public affairs efforts at many Fortune 50 companies through in-house roles and at outside agencies. So, Andy, thanks for being with us. Aaron Sibarium is a staff writer at the Washington Free Beacon, graduated from Yale. He was the opinion editor of the Yale Daily News. He was at the American Interest before he joined the Free Beacon. He's broken stories that we're going to talk about today, dealing with former Harvard President Gay, as well as the Walton Foundation and what has been going on there with DEI, as well as what happened during COVID and the use of racial preferences in medical treatments. Armand Toulouli serves as chief of staff for Chris Rufo at his nonprofit American Studio, where he oversees daily operations, partnerships, and media strategy. So I'm going to take a seat and we're going to dive into our conversation. So to begin with, I'm going to start with Aaron, if that's all right. So Aaron, can you summarize some of your reporting, especially over the last 6 months, regarding Harvard President Gay, what that has to do with DEI, right? Because she was the hubbub was around plagiarism, but what did tie that back, right, to DEI?
Sure. So I think the important thing to remember about Claudine Gay is that she was a career administrator. She specialized in administration very early on in her academic career. She was, I think, the dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences before becoming president of Harvard. And much has been made about her race and the perception that Harvard hired her due to her race and gender. That surely is part of the story, but the other part of the story is that she was a strong proponent of DEI initiatives. That's kind of how she made a name within the faculty and advanced through the ranks of Harvard's administration. And it was just reported, I think a month, maybe even less ago, by the Harvard Crimson that Harvard never even conducted a scholarly review of her work. They did not review her scholarship or take into account her publication record when making the decision to hire her, because they were more interested in other factors, right? As a result of that, they seem to have not caught a number of instances of plagiarism in her academic work, and that lack of due diligence blew up in their faces. But you asked about the link between DEI and plagiarism. This is clearly much broader than Claudine Gay, because since Claudine Gay resigned in early January, I and others have uncovered quite a few cases of other high-profile administrators, both at Harvard and elsewhere, who have been accused of, frankly, even more egregious research misconduct, both plagiarism and, in some cases, data fraud. So clearly, it's a little hard to know how much worse plagiarism is in the field of quote-unquote DEI than in other academic fields, where I suspect it's also more rampant than we think. But clearly we can say that the field of DEI studies, or whatever you want to call it, has a problem, because if in just 3 months the chief diversity officer of Harvard University and the chief diversity officer of Columbia Medical School and a high-level administrator at Harvard Extension School all are exposed as having severe plagiarism in their doctoral dissertations, I think that tells you something.
Yeah, thank you for that answer. And it's worth noting that she was a part, right, of what happened with Roland Fryer at Harvard several years ago. I mean, he's a decorated economist, very sharp, and she was a part of what ultimately was kind of persecution of him for comments that he made. So very good. All right, so Armand, let me move to you and your team and what Rufo and his team has done over the past 3 to 6 months. Can you kind of bring us up to speed? Where are we kind of in the orbit of rejecting DEI's discrimination?
Yeah, thanks. So actually, I want to back it up a little bit further, even just more than the last 3 to 6 months, is basically the past year. This is something that Chris talks about publicly all the time, is every year he likes to set a goal for himself as far as what he wants to accomplish. And last year, the focus was on universities and DEI. So we started out the year with a series of reports on universities in Florida and in Texas. And what we did is we found all of just the most egregious examples of DEI in practice. And this was a deliberate strategy on our part that we came up with, where we applied lessons we'd learned from the previous couple years, where we'd been working on CRT in K through 12, or gender ideology in schools. And what we'd found was, specifically with CRT, is the states that moved first on it happened to be smaller red states. I think it was West Virginia, New Hampshire, states like that. And they were much more susceptible to outside pressure from interest groups, from the NCAA, from a whole number of organizations, where they could kind of bully these states into complying and saying, no, you can't do this. So we thought to ourselves, okay, but Florida and Texas are the two biggest red states. They're powerful, and they have the strength to be able to basically tell these people to go pound sand, and no, we're going to do what we want. So that's why we focused on Florida and Texas specifically last year to start, and the reporting work was actually remarkably easy. That these people are not. They're not geniuses. I mean, I think we all know that. And
They're also not hiding what they're doing.
No,
right?
It's all out there in public. So this is actually a funny anecdote I like to give. Is we're probably not fans of Google in here, especially after the Gemini disaster. But they do have this one really useful function where you can do a site search for any domain out there. So you go to whatever school you want to look at, whatever it is, like universityoflorida.edu. And then you put into the search bar site : the domain, and then you can put whatever phrase you want, and it'll give you every page that they have listed with those phrases. So when we started doing research into these schools in Florida, he asked me like, "Hey, find whatever you can that's out there publicly." And I was like, "All right, this might be a bit of a challenge." And then as soon as I started, I'm like, "Oh no, this is gonna be really easy." So the first thing I would do is find the school's website and then look for George Floyd, and then that would be the kind of the keystone to then follow all the links from there, and they would have almost everything out there publicly, or if it wasn't public, you could just submit one FOIA request, and within a few weeks you have all the documents for like a public event. And so this reporting was really easy, and the strategy that we had behind it was we timed it out to be going on during the legislative session in Florida specifically, because we knew we had buy-in from the state government and from Governor DeSantis that this was something they wanted to move on, but they needed political cover basically, because if you start targeting diversity and inclusion, you're going to get an enormous backlash in the press, right? That is an easy one for them to come after you on. I was like, oh, well, they're opposed to diversity and they're opposed to inclusion. And that's not at all what it is, because if you look at DEI in practice, it's the opposite of that. It's not about diversity, and it's certainly not about inclusion. So that strategy worked out fantastically. That we saw first Florida and then Texas passed bills. They weren't perfect, but they were certainly a step in the right direction as far as removing DEI from public universities. And we hope to see more states follow suit. I think we've seen Iowa, Oklahoma, and then
Wisconsin.
Utah. Yep, Utah just recently, Wisconsin, and I think a whole host of states in the coming months should follow suit. So I think that's where we are right now. But what we need to do looking forward is just keep the pressure up. We try to create this illusion of we have eyes and ears everywhere, and that we're always watching. But ultimately, we're a small team. We can't be everywhere all at once. So the responsibility will fall to people in states all across the country, lawmakers, to they can find this stuff, and at public universities they have the power to get rid of this right away. We saw it just last week in Florida. University of Florida fired all of their DEI employees, and that was fantastic. And I think that's a great first step. But that's the first battle, and it's far from over.
Yeah, thank you for that. And you can find, like Jay mentioned on our first panel, more information about those states on our Heritage Foundation data visualizations page. It has a list of those states with a nice map. And just quickly to connect some of the dots, because you mentioned gender and you mentioned the transgender movement, to connect the dots here, it is true, right, that the groups that are radical on race are also radical on gender, and they make sure to sort of lob the ball back and forth between them, right? Black Lives Matter, in their 13 guiding principles, has the idea of the opposition to the Western prescribed nuclear family, right? I mean, the reason that we bring up these other radical topics as we discuss DEI is because they are all, right, linking to each other.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think something you'll notice is that for someone to be, a loyal foot soldier of the left, they can't only subscribe to one part of the ideology. It has to be everything, right? That you have to be woke on race. You have to be woke on gender. You have to be woke on decolonization. All of it. If you deviate from the party line whatsoever on the left, they will cast you out. And so it's a unified movement. And DEI is kind of the linchpin that connects all of it, right? It's the framework that connects all of these radical ideologies together.
Yeah, it's the bureaucratic apparatus, right?
Yes.
Of critical race theory.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Andy, thanks for your patience. So, talk to me about both the donor class as well as in the coalition's work, and what are you hearing and seeing about DEI, especially over the last 3 to 6 months?
Thanks, Jonathan. The first thing I'd say is I have academic envy. I didn't know it was this easy to get a PhD. I just have to I can just kind of copy from somebody else and I can get the creds. I can assure you that's not the case here at the Heritage Foundation with my colleagues. I'd say 3 quick things. One, we need to defund DEI. And the reason why we need to defund DEI is because DEI and CRT, which you just mentioned, and ESG, that's Karl Marx brand alphabet soup, right? DEI, CRT, and ESG are Marxism by acronym. And that's the fight. And we just need to think about that. This is about oppressor versus oppressed. This is putting us into categories and boxes and being able to manipulate that. And that if someone's manipulating categories and boxes, by definition, they're a bureaucrat, right? They might be in a very important role in a bureaucracy in the most positive sense in a government, but they're probably in a bureaucratic role in the worst sense of that word, or they're in a corporate America HR department. And if you think there's bloat in the government, let me introduce you to corporate America's HR departments. But that's number one. Number two is it's happening. It's happening already. The response to, it's a shame that it took October 7th for a lot of university funding to see the light and to have donors that we've all seen in the headlines like Ackman and Rowan and everything. But Ambassador Ron Lauder was here on stage. What a wonderful man. Joe Lonsdale, Joe Ricketts, and others have been fighting this fight for a long time. And in 1980, private donations to colleges and universities were about $4.2 billion. And by 2020, that was $59.5 billion. That's a lot of money. None of those donors, or I should say none, 99% of those donors are in support of free speech, not opposed to it. 99% of those donors want that funding to go into the classroom and into certain activities on campus. They're not funding DEI bureaucracies. But that's what happened, and that's what was happening. And the revolt is real, and it's quickening. And then the last point I would make to sort of connect the dots here a little bit more, I had a great breakfast this morning with my friend Devin Westhill from the Center for Equal Opportunity. But we were just talking about the shifts that we're seeing for funders for the Heritage Foundation, for his organization and other organizations. They were once giving to Pepperdine. They found out what was happening, pulled that money out, gave to the Heritage Foundation. They were given to the University of Michigan, saw what was happening with Jay Green and Lindsey Burke's work, pulled that money out, gave it to the Heritage Foundation and some other organizations, gave it to their local organizations, places that were going to do the things that they said they were going to do and would respect the integrity of donor intent. The last thing I would say is even things like Colonial Williamsburg, where you saw things happening. Our colleague Brenda Hafera wrote a piece about how Colonial Williamsburg was going woke, and we've had donors that we've known for a long time who said, I'm not funding this anymore. They took that money out and they put it in other places, including the Heritage Foundation and other organizations. And so this is real. It's happening. It's just the tip of the iceberg. But if you think about a shift in $60 billion of private wealth from individuals, organizations, certainly companies and other things, pulling away from the DEI bureaucracy and the corrosive influence of that on campuses, that's really, truly significant.
Yeah, you were mentioning some big dollar figures. At last count, I think the annual expenditure on DEI training is somewhere in the neighborhood of $8 billion a year, and that's annually, right? That's spent on those,
every time an individual goes through mandated DEI training, the devil earns his horns.
Yeah. Well, and I think, connecting the dots here, again, to not lose sight of this, right? The organizations and the groups that were opposed to the Supreme Court decision last year against the use of racial preferences in college admissions, they were advocating for racial preferences, right? And so when we say we are out to defeat DEI and that DEI should be defunded, what we are saying is you should not use racial preferences in your decision making, right? You should treat people based on their merit, their ability, right? And I mean, don't lose sight of this here, that this has suddenly become some sort of, conservative buzzword. I mean, we're actually pointing to processes that treat people differently based on the color of their skin, which is something that really should resonate in the hearts of all Americans. So I'm going to go backwards now. So Andy, I'm going to start with you again. All right. So I've seen your emails, and we've talked about ESG and what's happened in the ESG world. Can you kind of help the audience connect the dots a little bit between ESG and DEI? And I'll prompt you just a touch by saying, look, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal, I think it was last year, it might have been the year before, saying that earnings calls from companies, they're not talking about DEI anymore. They've just sort of left that part out. They're quietly sort of dismissing it. But help us connect the dots here. What's ESG really about, and how is it connected with DEI?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And I would say your scholarship is wonderful, and I've learned so much from Jonathan, and then these gentlemen and their the work that they do as journalists and shedding light on things really makes this conversation a lot easier to talk about. So it's a thrill to be up here with you guys. ESG is environmental, social, and governance, and the shorthand for that is that people on the left gave themselves a self-appointed moral authority on the environment first and foremost. It was the easiest way to shoehorn in their agenda, and they decided to start dictating the way that we would all live our lives. And so the E is how you live, the S is what you believe, and the G is that they get to keep score. And so that's not the way that I want to live my life, and I don't think most Americans, and I would argue most around the world don't want to live their lives. So here's one thing that we did to push back that has had some great results. I'll start with the result. 13 states across the country now have legislation that they've passed where their pension funds have to be invested and stewarded and managed to the benefit of the retirees. What was happening is a lot of people were trying to get in front of that, use that wealth to push a political agenda. And so our colleagues at Heritage Action, our colleagues in the coalitions field, Alexa and Wes, my colleagues that are here, we did a lot of work on just sort of getting organizations aligned around this. Great partnership with ALEC, State Legislative Group. But our Heritage Action colleagues really did a lot of lobbying in these key states. But right now, 13 states have passed legislation to say what is already enshrined in law, but now bringing a little more teeth to it to say that if you have a pension, it's your money, your value should be reflected in that, and not somebody else who sort of creamed that money off the top and decides to execute a political agenda against that. But this is not uncommon, right? I mean, this is what happens in corporate America. Corporate America, we really don't have a wealth problem in this country. The left might tell you they want to redistribute that wealth differently, but think about where the stock market is today. Think about every time you turn on CNBC and they talk about an all-time high. Start thinking about where that money's going, but also start asking questions about if DEI, let's look at it, it kills innovation, it undermines true engagement inside corporate America where you want to have these things happen, and it also just slows down economic growth by and large, and so it suppresses what I would say are employee salaries and other things because this money goes all to compliance and all that money gets sucked up, and then those are all the people that go to Davos who finally got punched in the mouth by our president, Kevin Roberts, and a couple other people a few weeks ago. But we're on offense in that space as well. And I think what you saw in corporate America was a sort of gilding of the opportunity to do this, but it was really people upstream from that, the investors like BlackRock and others who were dictating that behavior and saying they wanted to dictate that behavior. Then the last point I'll make is that's why they're all dropping out of Climate Action 100 right now, because there's a lot of pushback from the right. There's also antitrust issues and other things, and that's really just getting started.
Yeah, and with these corporations, the human resources arm, right, or side of corporate America tends to be the one that is just, waist deep, neck deep in the DEI movement, right? They're vetting everyone that comes in. They're the ones responsible for the trainings. I mean, that's why DEI is able to touch so many different parts of the decisions that are made.
Could I add one thing here?
Of course,
it's worth
sure.
noting, right, that the E and the S in ESG often conflict with each other, right? So I wrote a story a while back about how Philip Morris and other tobacco companies do surprisingly well on their ESG scores because they max out on DEI, even though their product kills people and is horrible for the environment, right? So there's another dynamic here too, where DEI allows corporations to kind of sanitize some of their more sordid activities and deflect some pressure that might otherwise come from the left. And I think that one fruitful avenue of attack I found is to kind of surface and heighten the contradictions, like a good Marxist. The ESG movement, and I know Chris Rufo, right? He has that sort of Gramscian heritage. I mean, I think he would broadly be in support of this, but it's true. A lot of the left's kind of bureaucratic edifice is internally self-contradictory, and ESG is a great example of how, when the left tries to do this unity of oppression, kind of unify all the different social causes together, you end up with something completely incoherent. And I do think it is worth pointing out the incoherences.
Yeah, most certainly. So thank you for that. So then my next question is for you again. So tell us about, you wrote something about Walton and their philanthropy in recent years. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so the Walton Foundation, the Waltons, the family that owns Walmart, they used to be very staunch Republicans, and then they kind of got more and more centrist to progressive over time, and that accelerated with Donald Trump. And so by 2020, you have the Walmart Foundation and the Walton Family Foundation funding DEI in public schools. And to be clear, this isn't like they fund a couple teacher trainings that just say be nice to everyone. This is that they fund teacher trainings that explicitly lay out the principles of critical race theory. They use those exact words. Everyone says, no, CRT is not taught in schools. Well, maybe not in schools, but in teacher trainings, they literally say, here are the tenets of critical race theory. Here's how you can incorporate these tenets into the classroom. That was done with Walton money. And in fact, there was even a presentation that at I think it was the Fayetteville Art Center. Fayetteville is just down the street from Bentonville, where Walmart was founded. And at this presentation, I think facilitators from some Walton-funded group literally said DEI can and sometimes must be imposed from the top down. That was literally a slide in their presentation, which we obtained from a FOIA. So you asked about the story. What I think it highlights is that DEI is not necessarily a bottom-up organic movement. It often is imposed from the top down. I think there are legal incentives, which we could get into, but it's also a matter of just if a really rich philanthropist funds DEI, and if that philanthropist, as is the case in Walmart in Arkansas, has a kind of monopoly on nonprofit giving, right? The whole sort of nonprofit economy of Northwest Arkansas revolves around the Waltons. You can't really opt out of DEI unless you want to be blacklisted by the main source of grant giving in your state. So, of course, everyone in Arkansas went along with this. Then Walmart got a lot of pushback, and they stopped, or at least I think they toned it down. But this is a great example of how DEI is driven by kind of top-down centralized pressures.
Yeah, and I would argue as well, especially in the education world, the unions, because they are, they have such a wide reach and such money and power in state houses that when they are pushing Black Lives Matter, critical race theory, which, by the way, is absolutely in K-12 classrooms, we can cite that chapter and verse later if you'd like. But when those interest groups are pushing, DEI, then it becomes whether or not a teacher wants to do it. They have to. So, Armin, so we've talked about gender a little bit. We've talked about what happened over the past year. Can you give us a sense of where we're going here, right? I mean, so what is this movement going to become as we defeat DEI in the next 3 to 6 months? What should we be looking for?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So I mentioned this briefly before, but that we absolutely need to keep the pressure up. That the momentum is on our side, but we can't. It's not time to take a victory lap yet. We certainly haven't won. There's still a long way to go. And I think two of the biggest lessons that we've learned in that we want to apply going forward is, first, there's this saying that people on the right love to use of facts don't care about your feelings. And it turns out that when you're trying to make arguments and you're writing these stories, that's not true at all. It is that people make their decisions based on feelings, not on facts. People like to pretend that they're fully rational. They're not. So making rational arguments against DEI is useful, but ultimately you need to be making the moral argument against this too. That this is morally wrong. We are, dividing people based on race. We are, sorting them into groups of oppressor versus oppressed. This is, dividing American society. It goes against everything that the founders wanted for this country, and so that's a much stronger argument to make rather than just getting into, oh well, it's ineffective and it doesn't do what it's supposed to do. No, it's wrong and it needs to be destroyed. It needs to be abolished from public life entirely. And then second, I would say is we need to stay vigilant, right? That just defunding DEI is not enough. Because if say they take away the funding for the DEI office, but then they reshuffle people around and they put them into some new department, and they essentially keep doing the same job under a different name, well then you have DEI in all but name, and that's not what we want either. So I think the big takeaway there is that the personnel is policy. That all of these institutions, universities in particular, but like he was saying, corporate America, basically any sufficiently large organization at this point has probably been captured by DEI, and the only real way to get rid of it is, frankly, to fire all the people who are responsible. And one small case study is at New College, where my boss was appointed to the board of trustees, and they cleaned house when the new board got in power. They fired the president, the provost resigned, they fired the DEI director, and they abolished the gender studies department. Is you need to essentially get these people out of positions of power. Otherwise, they will find a way to, worm their way back in and continue doing this stuff. So that's, I think, over the next few months, while we keep the pressure up and, try to get more and more states to get on board with getting rid of DEI in all, public institutions, we need to then make sure they follow through in the way that they did at the University of Florida of then get rid of the people too. So I think that's where we need to be going.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. We are starting to see that, and thanks to Aaron, some of Aaron's reporting and others about pointing that out, has led to those individuals pushing, the radicals pushing ideas. I think on the as we talk about the core moral issue here, I know that it is so important to return to that the idea of racial preferences is wrong. It is so opposed to American ideals. I was speaking in New York last year, and to an audience that didn't really like what I was saying about DEI. However, I did get them to listen when I started to point out that the Washington Post, the New York Times, McKinsey and Company, trade publications like Education Week have all released stories in the last 5 to 7 years talking about how DEI doesn't work and doesn't do what it says it's going to do. So while it may not be the linchpin, right, I do think you can get folks on the other side to sit up and listen when you start to say, hey, look, the very publications you're reading have pointed out the flaws in DEI and that it's not being successful. So hopefully that two-prong approach is something that can get folks, on the left or in the center to come along with us as we see it. So Andy, we talked about a year and a half ago about something I was writing for the Philanthropy Roundtable about large charitable organizations and how their mission statements have changed over time to incorporate DEI, right? It didn't used to be that way. So as you've talked with donors and as you've been around the country, what are they saying? I mean, you touched on a little bit in your first remarks, but what are they, what do they really think about DEI?
The conversation has changed over the last 12 months, probably aligned with what these gentlemen are talking about in terms of their reporting and what they've been highlighting. But it went from not confusion in a disoriented sense, but confusion as to why, to a curiosity as to what this was all about, to more of a furor and an anger that they won't support organizations that are outright doing things to undermine the American way of life. This is why I take this all back to Marxism, and I would tell you what would please any donor I've ever talked to, what would please them most is if I said, Mike Gonzalez has a book coming out on April 3rd on next-gen Marxism, and the following corporate boardrooms have invited him in for a briefing, and the following trade associations have invited him in to talk about it, and employees and share owners are writing to their CEOs and their supervisors and saying, I want this book on our book club list. I want to talk about this. That would please them more than anything. Here's the thing. It's happening. People want this conversation because they know we have history to tell us how Marxism works. We have history to show us what happens, which path, which choice leads to human flourishing and which doesn't. That's the moment that we're in. That's the conversation they want to have. curiosity to concern to outright anger and now action.
That's great. Thank you. So, Aaron, last story I wanted to ask about, we mentioned this when we were talking before the event about what was happening during COVID, the delivery of treatments during COVID-19. Can you tell us a little bit about your reporting on that?
Yeah, so long story short, in early 2022, this was when the Omicron variant wave was cresting, and resources were strained. A lot of states and private hospital systems allocated COVID drugs based on race. The way it worked was that there would be scoring guidelines to determine who was eligible for monoclonal antibodies or Paxlovid, that's the Pfizer antiviral. You had to score above a certain threshold to be eligible. And in a lot of states, you got extra points just in virtue of being not white, right? For example, in Utah, it literally said non-white race or Hispanic ethnicity, 2 points. That was in a government document posted online for everyone to see. They were not hiding it. Armin mentioned the importance of emotion and feelings. This was a good story because it really unified the facts and the feelings, right? On the facts, it was just very hard to defend this. It was a pretty brazen violation of the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution. And indeed, there were legal threats made, and that is what encouraged many of these states and hospital systems to back off of this. But it also was emotionally evocative, right? When people ask, well, why does DEI matter? Okay, fine, Harvard does affirmative action, but not many people go to Harvard. Does this really, who cares? Okay, you're a normal person in the state of Utah and you want COVID drugs. You can't get them because you don't check the right demographic box. That is a emotional gut punch. And, although you don't want to, I try not to say this stuff too aggressively in my stories. One guy did go on the record and say to me, look, incorporating race into medicine, some other regimes throughout history have tried that and it didn't go well, right? It does evoke some dark stuff. And the last point I would make about this is, so I don't hear from the donors that you do, but I have to say, I am not optimistic that donors on their own. It's great that Bill Ackman and Mark Rowan have seen the light, but this is not enough. And the reality is that they only did this when there was a moment in which it became acceptable, politically acceptable for liberals and centrists to come out against the excesses of the left. And what's good about stories like the race-based medicine is that they're so extreme and so crazy that I think they force, even The Atlantic wrote a story about my reporting and said, yeah, it's pretty bad. Right? You have to change what the center of gravity is so that the kind of risk-averse donors will come out and actually feel like there's a permission structure in which they can stop giving.
Yeah, thank you.
Actually, just real quick, incentives are changing. Keep up the great work. Keep writing the great stuff.
Yeah, I think as a natural follow-up to what Aaron was saying, first I want to clarify what I meant earlier, is that, the facts obviously do matter, and that they should be basically supporting arguments in favor of the moral claim that you're making.
Yes.
And that is the strongest way to persuade someone. But the other thing I've seen recently too is I have the Google alert set up, so I get stories whenever DEI gets mentioned in the news. So as my inbox gets it's overflowing these days with stories about DEI. One trend I've noticed, and I think is ultimately not going to be as useful for us, is a huge volume of stories focusing specifically on the dollar figure, the funding of DEI offices, and saying, oh, well, University of Virginia is spending like $20 million on DEI, and yeah, that's bad, and obviously they shouldn't be doing that. But when you go into that domain, you're ultimately then basically arguing over, okay, well, what's the right amount to be spending on DEI when the right amount is zero? So I think that kind of ties into what I was saying, is that you make the argument that there shouldn't be DEI at all, and then you back that up by saying, and they're spending $20 million that could be going somewhere else, using University of Florida as an example, that they reallocated the funding from their DEI office to faculty recruitment, which seems like a no-brainer, right? That if you want to have a good university, you need good professors. So spend that money instead of on DEI training, on recruiting the best professors in their fields to come teach at your school. It's a no-brainer. So I think that's a sign of encouragement, but also a word of caution that we need to remain focused and try to be as persuasive as we can. And then on the donor point you were making too, is I think it can probably be a little bit frustrating for those of us in this room who've been working on this stuff for years, that a lot of people came around just since October 7th, and it's a little bit frustrating to think back, like, okay, but where were you during the summer of 2020? But that comes with the territory, right, of being on the leading edge of something like this, is that you're always going to be there first. And part of our job is in media to change public opinion and open the door so people like Bill Ackman can then feel comfortable coming out strongly against DEI, and
because they know they're not isolated.
Exactly, right, that they know that they're if he'd basically done the exact same thing in August of 2020, he probably would have lost every friend he had in New York and been completely blacklisted from everything. So there's a reason why people are coming around now while it's safe. And yeah, it can be a little bit frustrating for those of us who've been sounding the alarm for years, but we take every ally we can get in the fight, whether they're just joining now or they've been with us for years. Welcome aboard.
Yeah,
so,
that's right.
That's another sign of encouragement that someone like him is willing to come out so forcefully against this stuff.
And I think that's a great way to close, to come on. Look, the water's warm, jump on in. I think we are protecting the ability and the position of treating people based on their choices, their decisions, their merit, and not just based on the color of their skin. Please join me in thanking our panel. And thanks to everyone who joined us online, who joined us here in the auditorium today. And we look forward to seeing you at the next Heritage event.